Hello, everyone. If you noticed, I basically am very low income technology, so I'm using the same overlay with a different title. It says play again because this is potentially the start of a new series or maybe just a one off, where the main focus is to take a second look at games or teams and assumptions that we make when we first look at what we see on the screen. I am here with Cabra Maravilla, the wonderful
Oh,
GOAT himself, former analyst for Mad Lions, which makes him like 1/1000th of an EU Masters champion. So that's very
yeah,
exciting. More famously known for his work with esports maniacos. There we go. I can pronounce
it's
Spanish
fun. Yeah,
sometimes. But luckily for you, this is in English. So
yeah.
we are going to discuss.
No,
Oh, go ahead.
no. I was gonna say it's better this way because the audience has no context whatsoever of what my my image or persona should be, and since your pronunciation is way better than in any other show I have been, I'm firing shots at anyone. I think we can do a good video. I'm happy to be the first one in this new, hopefully new series.
But so we are going to discuss the top four teams going into the quarterfinals. So the first seed teams coming out of each group, and a few questions and assumptions made from the group stage, and whether or not we think that they're wrong, correct, whether or not we think that their quarterfinals games will be difficult. And so we're going to start, of course, with KT Rolster, since they will be playing first against Invictus Gaming. And there were a few things, if you watched the group stage, that are a bit questionable about KT. Some of their games looked extremely clean, but of course that seemed because enemy teams were a bit inting against them. But a couple of games, if you watch LS VOD reviews or if you listen to the cast, there are two lane swaps in particular that they made that raised a couple question marks. And so we're going to look at their game against EDG and KT and talk a bit about whether or not we think their lane swaps are good or not. So, what is kind of your first impressions?
Mm, I'd say I would disagree with both. Like I don't know if you have the TL clip as well, but the in the EDG lane swap, I think it has merit the idea of trying to go for Herald first, since I do not think the Mountain Dragon is very instrumental for any of the comps here. The problem I find is that I really do not like that if you have the counter pick support, you would lane swap on a wave that's bouncing on your top lane, because I think this composition that KT drafted banks a lot on getting the Xayah ahead and being able to force Baron before Akali gets out of control. And if that's what you want to do, I think you really should value being ahead in power spikes and just not feeding bouncing waves to the enemy ADC, if that makes any sense. Because since you have a winning support matchup, you should be able to at least set up a more decent wave on the top lane and then reset again and do the swap in that moment, where you shouldn't lose a lot of herald control, but you still will get your ADC in a nicer spot overall.
I would agree with that. I think that there are obviously what instigated this lane swap is a bit unique because they fought over the dragon and KT believed that they had priority here because Scout was backing to get a new item and so Yukao could push out. So that was a bit helpful for them, but then they don't necessarily lose the dragon fight, but Ray gets two kills off of it, and then they have two waves pushing against them. So the question becomes, okay, EDG can go to whichever lane they want. So I think a bit of the opposite take. So kind of to vouch for KT, the question becomes, what should they have done? Because if they swap in either lane, they're behind tempo, right? If they go back bot, they're behind tempo because the lane will be bouncing back, and then Cyan has to go top. So do they value trading for a turret or not? And I think that comes down to whether or not they can actually contest this Rift Herald. I think, based on sort of the power spikes and the items that they have at this point, that they really can't contest the Rift Heralds. Because even if UCal, for example, has Rod of Ages, which is a completed item, to Scout's component for Gunblade. Basically, you're at a point where Scout is level 9. Scout can get a ton of pressure and basically kind of get to the point where he's one-shotting people. Whereas if KT wants to have any hope of winning fights, EDG have to all jump on them so that they can get a good turn there. So their options for winning the fight I think are a bit low. Plus EDG will be able to set up vision control and everything else for them. So I think it's really difficult for them to contest this Rift Herald. So they're better off just kind of trading. But
Yeah, I mean, I would agree to that. I think it's overall a pretty hard setup, however you choose to do it. And I think there is some merit to the idea of maybe hoping for a bad read on the situation by the enemy team. I do not think that it is that terrible if you get matched on the top lane. But yeah, overall, I think they shouldn't be able to contest it.
and then in the TL case, it's subtly different because the dragon isn't yet spawning. But at the same time, I think we're at like a level 8 Sivir and even items on the 80 carries. So the Sivir should be able to push a bit harder in the lane against the Kai'Sa. So even though you would say that KT have a winning matchup there, for me it's still more difficult to contest the Herald at that point. I think that they make it work pretty well overall, mostly because I don't think TL
TL
really
it a
understand.
bit.
Huh?
I think TL hinted a little bit because they have not yet recovered the mid lane pressure from Pobelter clearing the bot side, and then they just willingly face check against a composition that collapses so quickly as it is Nocturne Lissandra. So I don't really agree with how they were trying to play that side of the jungle.
Yeah, and I think the ramifications for them doing the swap are actually more felt on the bot side when they like don't reset after contesting the Herald and then just run to the dragon. It's like, of course, you know, the Aatrox will have time to get priority, and this will be a bad trade for you. And that kind of leads to another question: is this like when KT choose to back, when KT choose to think that they're strong, do they overestimate themselves a bit? And I think that that's a good question to ask about what a lot of people are looking at as potentially the favorite team of the tournament. So.
Yeah, I think that that's like an overall trend on KT because they will often go for these like very weird setups that some from time to time uh, they really work because they actually bring in an idea that maybe the enemy is not considering of how they can trade faster on one side and then being able to match with teleport on the other. But in general, I also think that they will set up or try to go for objectives that they do not really have a clear reason why they should win other than they have the first position on the objective. So I think I would agree with that criticism of KT. I think it's one of the bigger issues they've been showing for quite a long time.
So what do you make of kind of IG's chances against them then? Because that's really the question that you have to ask at this point.
Yeah, I mean, my thing with IG is not only that I do not value Jakilov in terms of an actual like any kind of competition. Uh, My thing comes more from the fact that I do not think that IG have a very strong jungle setup or that they really are good at transitioning their solo lane advantage into map control in the mid game. So even though I would rate KT as a team that has this problem overextending, I think a team that is good at setting up engages and in general playing like very strong collapse composition, sort of more like what we saw of RNG on the group stage, is more suited to punish them. But I wouldn't think that IG should have an individual skill matchup, an individual skill advantage. Sorry. And in that context, I find it hard to imagine them winning 3 games by this sort of a playstyle that I think is really bad for being able to catch people out of position, which is the poor control in the river overall. I think it does not match well into what KT have showcased to be their main weakness, sort of to say.
So would a generic team kind of have to do to take on KT then?
Mm. I actually think RNG are the team that's stylistically best matched,
Okay.
best suited to take on KT because I would say that they often you often see them fault either because they get too cocky on some sort of trade, especially around the bottling. I think even though Deft has come really hyped on the top 20 player list, I think his individual skill is really, really good, but he gets into positions that it's more like there's no reason to get there other than you think you can outplay your opponent. And I think the combination of RNG having such an individual skill bottling with the fact that they really like to play these straightforward compositions of feeding a Kai'Sa or a Sivir that's pretty in meta at the time, and then running face at you can really, really punish KT for for this sort of tendency of maybe taking a turret and instead of resetting, thinking they can get Dragon or they can invade this buff that they really can't. And usually they can outplay teams, but the problem is that when you are facing sort of dumb champions like Sion, Urgot, and stuff, you do not really get that room to outplay, and you just will get collapsed on and really, really punished.
It's a good transition because you mentioned RNG, and the RNG is the next team that we have to talk about there. So, you know, they are an interesting team to discuss because before watching this tournament, I rated really highly kind of their 131 and how they play out with their mid laner and their top laner. And for a while, even when UCI was on the squad, they were a very kind of mid centric team. And then they had so much turmoil with their roster that they relied a lot on Xiaohu in summer last year to really effectively carry the team. But as time has gone by, they've become more and more Balian focused. So there were a couple of games in group stage, especially the first round game against Genji, where you come into question about okay, so are RNG actually playing side lanes well? Are they actually balancing their map effectively in these situations? Which is very relevant because they will be playing against G2 Esports, which kind of made squeaked their way past the group stage by playing 1-3-1s. So, what is kind of your take on this situation?
Mm, you will have to correct me on this because I do not watch a lot of China, but my impression in general was that Letme has a bit of trouble recognizing both when he's on the weak side and he just has to back off of the turret, or just straight up when you shouldn't be there at all. I think it's even though he has shown individual faults in other respects, I think the key issue that why I actually think G2 stylistically into RNG, even though I predict RNG to take it, is because he's been constantly showing this problem that RNG will move on the other side of the map to do some sort of play to try to siege a turret or generally just to get control, and he will just not respect at all the fact that the enemy jungler has not been seen in maybe a decent while, and just stay on the turret in these split pushing matchups that they can really, really punish you. And I think G2 showed, well, not only G2, I think Gen G should have actually taken their first game against RGL as well. Both these teams have and others have shown that actually split pushing is quite strong in this meta, even if we weren't anticipating it due to the time warp tonic and all this bullshit that's being played on the top lane. But I think
It's a good way to put it.
yeah, it's quite a big issue because once Letme is completely chained to the turret, not only will RNG start bleeding pressure, but actually they won't be having their like main front line. Their composition usually depends on not as much because they need to protect the UCI, but because I feel that they really, really bank on getting good engages and just sort of playing a really good team fight after feeding waves to UCI. So yeah, I do not know if this is a overall trend of the team, but I'm worried about Letme's capacity to recognize his own weak side, and he should just back in plenty of situations or go farm his jungle, and instead he's under turret just chilling and waiting to be killed.
I think it's a bit interesting because I remember specifically in KZ there were against Kingzone and MSI there were games where he would be under turret and you would know if you had any idea if you have ever played a game of League of Legends before you would know that the entire team of Kingzone is about to be in your lane and dive you, right? Absolutely 100%. And the way RNG sort of dealt with this is that Xiaohu would push out mid and TP top and kind of try to defend with him, while UZI pushed out his bot lane, went mid, took Xiaohu's like bouncing wave back towards him, and then got a gigantic lead bot off of that, and then they minimized the kills top 2v4 or something like this. So I think RNG kind of are content with using Letme as bait overall. So for me, it more comes down to how they're playing their side lanes in the mid to late game and whether or not that's good. Because I feel like in this Gen G match in particular, there are a couple of unique points. One is that they got Xiaohu ridiculously far ahead, so you would think that in general the Rise would be able to match the Camille at a certain point. But at the same time, you have Camille being in a fairly unique position where like the extra Q damage proc on her Q just makes her decimate turrets completely. So even if you're able to forestall the push on that side, you have a point where Cube is just attacking. And there were a couple of key
Yeah.
mistakes that I saw in this match where, for example, they're not taking Letme is teleporting when he shouldn't, or their Xiaohu isn't using fake pressure effectively to go to the mid lane, so they end up being able to collapse on him, and this gets both of these kind of mistakes get Cube really far ahead, and then RNG basically are left with the choice of desperation grouping with Rise, which is never a choice that you really kind of want to be left with, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if I buy this whole using let me as bait, because for me often it just feels like I remember this play at the Herald where it's not only obvious that he's getting collapsed on, he actually sees the people that's coming to gank him, and still he stays to clear the wave and tries to, I think, get a trade into the enemy top laner, and then he just dies
Sure.
and they lose turret Herald and his life. So for me, mm, I don't really know what the logic behind this whole ordeal is in bot review, because I think they have to have noticed. It's not like it's extremely advanced League of Legends. So yeah, I don't know. I think this will really hurt them in their match against G2.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the thing about G2 is that they are aware of how to maximize the trade to top side. I think that's a concept that a lot of teams struggle with. I think from RNG's perspective, even if enemy teams are trading for topside, they will get a way better trade in bot just because of the way that the map and the lanes and everything are set up. And that's why I think a lot of teams have found way more use forcing bot against them, because even if they're losing bot lane, they won't say, okay, we have a top advantage, we should lane swap, or we have a top advantage, we should play the top side. They just kind of continue to try to force disadvantageous bot trades. So for me, it's more this team has become a team that doesn't really understand when they have advantages on other sides of the map, or doesn't, maybe they understand, they most likely understand, they just don't care, you know? So that's more of the worrying issue that I have.
So what team do you think can really punish this flaw?
Team of the teams remaining, I think that's why IG match up better against them than a lot of people think they would. For example, is that IG obviously care way more about their top side than most of the teams in China. I think that's a big reason why IG match up fairly well. Even though I don't think IG are as good of a team overall as RNG. So that's
Mm.
one team. Of the first seeds, Afreeca, potentially. I actually think Afreeca are in a decent position to counter this type of playstyle. I think RNG, like you said, are matched up pretty well against KT, but those would be kind of my shout outs for teams that I suspect will punish RNG more for this kind of play.
Yeah,
Also,
I think
if they don't
it's a
ban
good.
Camille against G2, or it's possible, but at the same time, I feel like,
They are banning Camille.
I mean, even if they don't ban Camille, I feel like you get way more trades against G2's bot lane if you ban Heimer and Tom Kench anyway. So we'll see, we'll see.
I mean, you can still play. I don't know if the brand is reasonable out of G2, but I'd say you can still play stuff like Sivir and be pretty okay, or
Yeah,
even you bring up the six if you really wanted to be cute in your approach. And I think for the purposes that they are drafting these ADCs, I think it would work just fine.
I think that yeah, again, it's not so much the Heimerdinger, in my opinion, as the Tom Kench. I think Tom Kench is like the biggest pick for G2. Excuse me. The biggest pick for G2 of any of them because it gives them a lot of utility to collapse on sides, gives them a lot of safety in the bottom lane if teams want to trade really hard for bot side. So for me, the Tom Kench is even bigger than the Heimerdinger. Obviously, the Heimerdinger is lossless, so it's still worth banning. But at the same time, I'm more concerned with Wadid's champion pool because, as you said, like Heimerdinger has, or excuse me, Hjarnan has a wider selection of champions he can play than just Heimerdinger. So.
Yeah, also in the compositions they are usually playing, picks like the Rakan, where I would say what it is pretty proficient with. I don't think they are that good actually. I think their value is not maximized when you're trying to play for your side and drafting shit like Nocturne and just camping for Wunda. So yeah, I think that champion pool might be an issue.
What teams would you favor to be RNG then?
To beat RNG, mm, I'd say my number one pick would be Afreeca Freaks,
Okay.
mainly because I think it's RNG has one of those top laners, and I've been hating on Letme a bit these days, but I think it's one of the few top laners that will actually showcase the skill difference against the best top laners in the tournament and just be able to fall behind purely on not only because the matchup requires, but just because he's a bit disappointing compared to other top laners. And in general, I think that Afreeca have very smart approaches to how they deal with enemy compositions, and the fact that they usually play stuff like the Galio that can really cover for their silence and make trades extremely awkward, and that King has this very wide champion pool he can draw from at any moment, makes it hard for RNG to sort of stall their top side trade. And in general, because of how the side lanes, how I think teams are playing the side lane in this tournament, I'd say that I favor a team that's playing a very strong split pusher over a team that's playing uh, trading through the ADC and sort of team fighting composition, mainly because there's a lot of strong split pushers in meta. Well, not in meta, but that you can play sort of like Akali, Camille. You can even go Aatrox into Urgot, or you can bring out weird shit like I think you can play GP into Blind Sion or stuff like that, which is what I'm expecting out of Letme. I think that side lane pressure would really make it hard for RNG to find fights, and they will get a bit choked out by it. I say Afreeca overall.
Yeah, I would say that if RNG are matching well against a team like G2 that split pushes really hard, it's because they have a lead on Xiaohu and Xiaohu is matching Wonder. I think that's most likely going to be their answer. And this was kind of the answer that they tried to have, but it just got to a point where they probably didn't feel comfortable matching the Camille. I'm not 100% sure why, because Xiaohu was still ridiculously ahead relative to the Camille by the time they started grouping. And I think it was just maybe a mental thing, or they saw an opportunity to force and they took it. So that's possible, but we'll see how they do. I think the matchup is really interesting overall because the way that Afreeca approached the mid section is interesting, and the way that RNG approached the midsection is interesting in a 1-3-1 setup. But you're just, it's like 2 for 2 already. You're giving me these perfect transitions. You name RNG last time. Afreeca is naturally the next team. I feel like this is kind of the most interesting question because after group stage, everyone is kind of discounting this team, even saying that they might lose to Cloud9.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
But
one of the biggest narratives I heard is just that they play slower. And what does that even mean from your perspective?
I'm honestly not really sure what playing slower means in this context, because
Sure.
usually when you have two drafts, you're either taking advantage of the things you have or not taking advantage in favor of other stuff. So I think if you're playing your composition reasonably well and the composition makes sense, the speed at which the composition develops should not be a factor on whether the composition is intelligent or not. So I think that more like the for me the issue with Afreeca is that for the first 2 days, it seemed like they were each player was focusing a lot on drafting for themselves and just sort of getting pretty good picks or decent matchups to play out, but the compositions didn't necessarily. Maybe they didn't. It's not that they glued badly, but they matched really poorly into the enemy composition and just didn't have synergy on the right. Um, how could I put it? On the right points of pressure. Where for me, Afreeca is a team that is really good at understanding what the enemy team wants to do and building a pretty strong composition to abuse that. And mm, yeah, I'd say that the problem on the first 2 days had nothing to do with playing slow and everything to do with the team just not being on the same page or having a concrete game plan and a good idea on how to exploit the enemy composition.
Yeah, I agree that that's generally how
Which
a freak.
has nothing to do with the playing slow thing, but I do not really know what to say about that. I haven't heard anything of that on the Spanish scene.
I think a lot of people are equating like Gen G's problems with Africa's problems and saying that the reason why Western teams are beating Korean teams is because they force really fast, and Korean teams are used to, oh, we play slow with trackers, knife, and defensive play, and it's like, yes, let's make every Korean team SKT. It's my favorite narrative ever. But
Yeah, Kelsey, I'm not tilted by this at all.
no, not at all. But I think Africa's problems are not the same as Genji's problems. I think that some people would point to the last game that Africa played against G2, where it seemed like G2 were really winning really hard most of that game, but there were a lot of issues with them having good answers to sort of the mid to late game because they had only really Cassiopeia that could theoretically match up, and it would still not match up well against kind of a Ryzen side. And then you have an issue with overall Kaisa, Gragas, Alistair being Africa's midsection. You're not going to be able to force on that mid turret. So unless you get Herald, you're basically kind of screwed in terms of getting the first tier 1 mid and being able to force on their midsection. So I think that Afreeca is sort of playing this slowly. There were moments where I questioned their teleports a bit, but they used teleports to stall for the most part in the early to mid game, and then even then you see Keen just being able to push out multiple lanes. Like he teleports bad, but then he runs mid, knowing that they've already kind of lost that altercation. Pushes out that
Yeah.
lane, runs top back before his opponent, pushes out that lane, gets a lead, and is able to have a lot of threat on rise as the game progresses. So I think that Afreeca still played that intelligently, and there are some question marks with them, but at this mostly about like if teams don't force mid, what do they do? Because they set up a lot of their compositions and a lot just to play to punish teams that will force mid while Keen is side laning. But other than that, I actually am not. I haven't really lost confidence in Afreeca because I feel like they won't make the same mistake going into group stage that going into brackets that they went into group stage, which was I felt like they didn't scout at all or care. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this for me, this draft is more so like what I would think of an Africa Freaks composition, where I think the Rice is pretty smart to be able to, even if you are not able to pressure sidling, the fact that you can just clear and really stall the point at which Wunder can pressure the sidling, sort of. I think for the time the Camille can really start forcing on the Rice, I think you should have two be nearing on the three items on the Kaisa, and if you're going AP Kaisa against G2's composition, which is overall all squishes, and Tankench, which is half and half, you have a really good setup for the Galio, and you can really punish the two immobile carries G2 is playing. So even though they are playing like this, well, sorry, it's Aatrox, it's not okay. Now into Aatrox you can clear for ages as right, and then you can really start punishing the immobility of the carries and sort of have a pretty straightforward plan to force picks overall with the Alistar. I think this composition is actually pretty smartly crafted, and even if that team fight around Dragon where Spirit maybe didn't take the correct route, it doesn't really matter because the composition just interacts so well into G2s. It's really, really hard to get any sort of advantage because you don't really have an actual side lane pressure. Even if you get ahead on the Aatrox, the fact that Rice can match you with his ultimate ultimately means that you shouldn't be able to get very oppressive flanks that give you a decent enough setup to transition that advantage into a decent Baron.
Yeah, and I think there are just a lot of tiny smart things about this composition. Also, just you have a lot of AD on G2 side, which is not unexpected because they will probably take Aatrox, and then you have Rise and Alistair, which can itemize like very effectively and play very effectively against something that has a Aatrox, Camille, Jhin, those types of scenarios. So I think it's a pretty good answer to what G2 wants to do, and the fact that they aren't necessarily forcing everything like Vitality or C9 did in Group B. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are unprepared for teams that are forcing everything. So
Also,
I'm not really worried about
to be
Afreeca that
fair,
much.
oh no, sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
go ahead.
No, I
No,
finished.
I was going to say that to be fair, uh, some of those forces in group stage, I'm not trying to take merit from C9 and Vitality, but come on, they are not best of five forces. I do not think a team that's having everything on the line will do this sort of shit that RNG was pulling on those games. For example, I remember in the Vitality game when they tried to get to turn a fight with the Lissandra, even though they have absolutely no vision and they are already plenty ahead with this composition that's centered around Kai'Sa's power spikes, or in the C9 game where Xiaohu straight up flashes into Fog of War when he's playing against Shen. It's like, come on, this shit isn't gonna happen in a real game. Let's be realistic.
And C9's composition actually kind of with the Zillion and everything else relies on teams to force against them to an extent. And I don't see Afreeca being that team either, so I don't see this matchup being as close as some people are projecting, and I still think Afreeca are really fine to make the final theoretically. I think the Afreeca versus Fnatic matchup is interesting, but I still think that it's not out of the question at all for them to make the final. So I was just gonna ask you, what do you think of Fnatic versus Afreeca? So
Mm. I don't really have a strong opinion on that because I I don't know how exactly the matchup should go. So if you have an opinion, I'm curious because when I think of the different things teams do, I'm not exactly sure how Africa can punish Fnatic's strategy.
So the way that because I've alluded to this a bit so far, is the way that I view how Afreeca like to set up the map is they want to get a strong side lane pressure point out of Keen, and then they want to have the enemy team group as four or more against them mid, and then they want to use Kuro and and Tucson to get picks off against the flank. So they'll pick someone off of the side flank instead of Vision with that in mind. I think that Fnatic do kind of play into that, the way that they like to play the game. But it comes out more like the question of will forcing teams do well against Afreeca is a bit more relevant when you consider Fnatic, because they will work really hard on getting good favorable matchup bots and having support jungle and mid all pressure enemy mid
Mm.
laner. So I think that there are definitely options for Fnatic, which leads us into the next part of the show. I didn't do that on purpose at all, of course. Which is, how do you think that Fnatic play out their early game? Because a lot of focus goes on caps as
Mm.
kind of the star, but in group stage, a lot of assessment was, okay, Rookie was by far the best performer, but the rest of Fnatic kind of outperformed IG.
Mm. For me, it's true that Fnatic really like to pressure the mid lane, and that's where a bit of the Afreeca free matchup problems come to mind for me, which is the fact that um, we are often talking about how Fnatic's bot lane doesn't have the widest champion pool in the world, and they will play just like Sivir, Tristana, Shaya, and then maybe some Ezreal or some Kai'Sa in finals. But it's not like picks you would think of these players for. And especially, I think this is more true when we talk about Hylissang and how he really likes to play champions that are able to influence the mid lane when he's unable to roam, which usually in Europe is easier because the individual skill of the combined modeling is just very high compared to other teams. So if they ever get a favorable trade, it's likely that either in a roam or through a reset, Hylissang will visit the mid lane and either set up a good vision for caps, or just team up with Broxa and play these sort of very strong 3v3s that either you match or you have to concede mid lane pressure. And in general, this puts caps in a very comfortable position. So because Afreeca do not really like to play that high pressure bot lane style, I was worried that this might be enough for Fnatic to be comfortable in the matchup.
I do think that the argument that Fnatic rely a lot on ball lane pressure has some merit, because you saw in the first game against IG that if Reckless and Hillsong got smashed by Nings going bot early, they couldn't get pressure. They couldn't have Hillsong have successful roams without Reckless getting punished for it. And it was a bit more difficult to play out that game. But I agree with you that reset opportunities generally still give Fnatic a window to influence the mid lane. And it could be a more narrow window. I think there's a bit of a difference between Afreeca and IG, in the sense that Kuro is not going to be someone who constantly looks to counter pick mid and push out super far anyway, to a point where he can get caught by those types of flanks. I think he's more used to teams doing that to him than Rookie is. uh, so I think that that's a bit of like, if Hylissang goes mid against Afreeca, it may be a bit more difficult for them to get anything. But obviously, Afreeca may not even be the match that we see in versus Fnatic, may not even be the match we see in semifinals, and the question of whether or not that kind of tactical work against EDG is a slightly simpler one. So, what are
Mm.
your thoughts there?
I wanted to expand a bit on the
Okay.
original question of bot lane dependency,
Mm-hmm.
because for me, even though it really gets played up, I do not think like Fnatic have this sick mid jungle synergy. I actually think they are a bit disconnected, and at times the vision setups they will choose are not necessarily the best ones for caps to be able to transfer pressure. So if they get behind on the bot lane, I find they have a really tough time coordinating their mid jungle and trying to get a good setup that is able to transfer pressure back if this does not come through the either getting a pick on the jungle or just generally collapsing on the enemy bot lane. So yeah, I just wanted to expand on that, because I think that the narrative of the mid jungle synergy is a bit unfair, and it's more based on the fact that they really really like transferring all this bot pressure into mid, and especially with these really strong picks to be able to do so. Because even if you do not think of Braum as the best ganker in the game, which he's not, firstly, Hylissang plays it very well, but also he's really determining on either a 2v2 or a 3v3, because of course his passive is absolutely oppressive on on extended fights. So overall this makes it so the enemy team doesn't have a lot of options to contest Fnatic on these sorts of plays. And this in general is how the sort of mid jungle synergy gets a bit played up. So I would agree that if you are able to punish their bot lane, you should be in a very good position against Fnatic.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think a lot of people ask like the Soaz versus Bwipo question. I think that if Soaz is playing, they're more likely to be able to transfer top pressure to mid in the same way that they do with bot lane, because Soaz is very smart about how he does those types of rooms, whereas I don't think Bwipo does it as effectively. He is actually pretty. Bwipo, I think, actually is really good at fake pressure though. Like he will leave top and make you think he's going mid, but he won't necessarily lose creeps for it or go all the way. So I think that that's an interesting distinction as well. So for me, it's I do agree that there is definitely kind of a bot lane dependency, and that's why RNG in my mind has always matched up really well to Fnatic. Because if you have a team that's as good as punishing bottom lane in the early game, then if you're opting into a blind pick mid matchup with caps, there's not a lot of answer. And I also think that Xiaohu is an underrated part of RNG, as I've already kind of outlined. But enough about RNG. It's all good. I think against EDG though, Fnatic probably don't have much of a problem. I feel like EDG are gonna be a little bit of a poor man's IG against Fnatic in terms of how they try to play. So
What would you say is the main differences in how IG and EDG play their early games?
I think that oh, wow. That is a good question. I think the IG are more likely to draft correctly to play around bot lane. It's probably the best way to put it. I feel like EDG will draft a losing bottom lane matchup and just try to force around it and say, you know what, we'll outplay your 3v3 anyway, and just try to snowball like that. I also think that IG are better at using side lane pressure on red side to get vision around Baron. So they'll have the shy, like split pushing on bot side, and then be able to use the fact that people are trying to collapse on the shy to get wards around Baron. Whereas EDG, I think, just don't know how to do that very well. And they mostly rely on Mako face checking the area, which is why tank supports like Alistar are absolutely fundamental to the way EDG play. And for me, the Europe versus China matchups really rely on limiting the champion pools of the second seed team's bottom lane. So that would be my big difference between EDG and IG
That,
overall.
that's that's a pretty cool parallelism, actually.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, for me, EDG, of course, I don't have crazy knowledge about the team, but I don't know. I don't even know why they got to look as good as they did on group stage, because they were a bit on fire during the playing, even if they managed to look very dominant once the playoffs came. But even then, they were playing these super straightforward compositions, and still they were managing to fuck up priority in team fights extremely badly. To me, it seems like a I don't know. They seem like a team that it's almost as if they didn't have any idea of what they wanted to do, and they went forward with whatever they thought was reasonable at the time. So I think they should be overall a pretty easy matchup for Fnatic. I'm expecting a dominant series. Maybe I'm being a bit of an EU fanboy, but I don't think that. they can bank on individual plays and outmatching talent, like I think they could into other teams, and particularly into Team Liquid, whom I think had a bit of well, you covered this on one of your videos, but also not only like like Povelter conceding pressure constantly, but also the fact that I don't really love the champion pool he brought into the tournament, and I
Sure.
think that was a big limiting factor onto the what game plans TL was able to choose from, which I do not think will be the case against Fnatic at all. So in general, I'm expecting Fnatic to take an sort of easy win.
I think Azir is a really interesting pick for them as well because even if iBoy kind of ends a team fight, sometimes you have the ability for EDG to get mid lane pressure and scale very well with sustained damage from the Azir picks. I think that that's something else that Fnatic can look at. Like the one game against TL, there was Alistar and Azir on EDG's side, and I was just like, okay, they watched zero LPL VODs, I guess, but it was interesting. I would say that iBoy being somewhat bold and a bit coin flippy is an advantage that EDG will have that Jackie Love
Yeah.
that IG don't, because Jackie Love has more of issues with pressure, and I think that iBoy will not. So there's always that option. So
Wait, are you saying IG's bot lane wasn't coin flippy on their games against Fnatic? Because
I would say they were coin flippy and different for a different
no, no,
reason. I
yeah,
would
yeah.
say it was like more of a
Of
mental thing.
course, I understand. I understand
Yeah.
what you mean.
Let's say that as Jackie Love gets further and further up in the level of competition, he encounters new mental obstacles. You know, he kind of got over his LPL playoffs thing this summer, but then it's like, oh, Worlds is a completely different stage. So nerves again.
Yeah, it seems like he. But even I wouldn't say it's on the Jackie Love there because for me, I think it was what game were they playing Blue Side? The third game where Baolang was playing Alistar and they were just forcing at the randomest times when they had absolutely no intel on the enemy jungler under Fnatic's turret in a matchup where you can get easily all in by the Tristana. For me, it didn't make any sense what they were doing, and Baolang had to constantly be resetting on that lane. It looked to me that they were taking pretty dumb trades overall, and this was really bleeding pressure into the map. So I wouldn't say it is totally fair to blame it all on Jackie Love choking. I'd also say they didn't have a clear idea on how the bot lane should be played on their draft.
Yeah, I think I agree with that because I also think that people are really hyping Brox and Caps' mid jungle synergy, but the way to beat IG domestically has always been just have better mid jungle synergy because they're not super good at that. Like it's mostly on rookie. A lot of people just blame it entirely on Ning, but I really just think it's they don't necessarily communicate like, okay, I'm going to be doing this camp and this camp, and then I want to invade. It's more like I'm invading now. Oh, mid isn't pushed out. I guess whatever. You know that kind of. It really seems like there is a big comms problem. Obviously, Ning didn't have the best last two games, and everyone says that Baolan is the worst player to come to Worlds from LPL this year. I always
Oh,
kind of hiss in pain when that is stated, but I can't really come up with a good counterpoint. Potentially,
hey.
yeah. I mean, Ray, yeah, but Ray had like these two really standout games in group stage as well, so it's hard to completely put it on him. But I would say Ray would be the counterpoint there. So, but yeah, I think this should be for me. It's like we should still have the first seeds winning, and I don't think that which quarterfinalist match is the closest in your opinion,
I'd say Afreeca Fnatic is the closest,
or
but
quarterfinal, not semifinal.
a quarterfinal. Oh,
Yeah,
okay, okay. Yeah, I was just assuming they will both get there. Closest quarterfinal. Hmm. I think for me it has to be KT against IG,
Okay.
simply because even though I do not think they statistically match all that well, I don't put it past KT to int in a few occasions and just if IG gets ahead of an early game play, they can really run away with the game. So I'd say that yeah, I think I'll say KT into Invictus.
I say in some ways KT is like the final form of IG because they all want to win lane as well.
Yeah.
They just do it in a more team oriented way. So yeah, that's it's kind of a good one to put against because I think both of these teams will have games where they're doing something just really questionable, and we covered that a bit. So it's a fair one to put forth.
Which one do you choose?
I would say the same. I think a lot of people are looking at Afreeca C9, but I really don't see it. So yeah, I'm not insane.
I
That
I,
so
I just heard like weed is getting really legalized on the States, so maybe that's why the narrative is so much in favor of C9. But I think they got away with having um, a group where their strongest picks really matched well into what the enemy teams were looking to do into them. But now that they're sort of their best strat has been revealed and Africa have a few days to prepare for them, I do not expect C9 to have options of getting out.
I think that's fair. I think that Nocturne is going to be probably the most contested pick in those games because both teams really know and understand the value of Nocturne if you want to play towards topside. So should be. I think as long as that's out of the way, there are fewer X factors, and it should be pretty Afreeca favored. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much for coming on. I know that it's late in Korea now, but it's been fun for me, kind of reviewing and looking at some of these assumptions and games again. So hopefully you have a good quarterfinals. And
for bringing me here, and you can follow me on at CABRAVILLA, Cabra Maravilla.
yes, it's written
Good
on your
luck.
screen. You're good to
Yeah.
go.
Oh, okay, okay. I was trying to do the shameless plugging, but
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you very much for
Mm-hmm.
bringing me to. I had a lot of fun.